BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, you cannot have a long-term plan for the country unless you have a long-term plan for our children's healthcare. And here are the facts that we know. 5-year-old children are consuming their body weight in sugar every year.
There are significant comorbidities associated with COVID, and we do need as a country to address obesity and the sad fact that we are, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, considerably fatter than most other European nations.
This white paper has one clear message above all others. It's time for politicians to stop telling people to make healthy choices, time to start actually helping them to do it.
It's 2025 and we're still asking the same old questions. How do we get people eating better, reduce obesity, improve health, ease pressure on the NHS, and help more people stay in work, live longer, and crucially, feel happier? Well, I'm joined in the studio today by 3 people whose working lives are spent developing answers to that big how. Anna Taylor is head of the Food Foundation. Now, Anna, the Foundation's been, I might say, relentless in its research on what poor food is doing to us all, especially to those people who actually are poor. How would you describe the Foundation's aims?
We really exist to package up the evidence and present it in a way to policymakers and to businesses which inspires them to act. So what we tend to do is couple more traditional forms of sort of academic evidence, numbers and statistics, that kind of thing, with the real experience of people, particularly people that don't have a lot of money. And we have a group of ambassadors who work with us and they tell us about the reality. And then we test ideas with them to make sure that the policy proposals we're putting forward would really make a difference to their lives.
Great. Dr. Dolly Van Tulleken is another original, and she's disrupting the way food policy has been done in Britain. She's been doing that for quite a while. She's a visiting researcher at Cambridge University's MRC Epidemiological Unit, where she did a PhD looking at UK government obesity policy, which really meant documenting and understanding its failures. There were a lot of failures, right?
Yes, the government has been trying to do something about obesity and food-related ill health for about 3 decades, starting in the early 90s when the first government obesity reduction targets were published. And since then, the government has published almost 700 individual policies to try and tackle obesity and food-related ill health. And yet the rates of those have not got better. They've got worse in that time.
And then to Ben Reynolds, who's been involved with some of the most successful food campaigns over the past 30 years in his work at Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. Campaigns like the one with Jamie Oliver to get the government committed to that very successful tax on sugary drinks. And we'll hear more about how preparation for that had to be done with some secrecy within government. Now he's working Europe-wide as Executive Director of the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Ben, Europe-wide, when we've pulled out, what's that got to do with the price of British eggs?
I think it's still incredibly important that we have this relationship. We are part of Europe, even if we're not part of the EU. And it's really our mission to bring the best ideas from across the rest of Europe to bear in the UK. And there's so much we can learn from different countries. And vice versa. There's lots that they're really interested in learning from us, whether it's on food policy, agriculture policy and beyond.
Well, after all that research, campaigning and failure, we just seem to get fatter and sicker by the month in the UK. But we're on the edge of change, possibly. Finding out what the new government plans to include in what they describe as an ambitious new food strategy. Their aim, they say, is to create healthier, more easily accessible food, to tackle obesity and give children the best start in life and help adults live longer, healthier lives. How will it do that? What will it change? And what needs to change? Well, Anna, last week the Food Foundation published its annual overview of what the government needs to know and what it needs to do, called, cheerfully enough, the Broken Plate Report. Give us some of the headline statistics from that.
I mean, what the report really describes is the challenges which people up and down the country face in trying to put a healthy, nourishing meal on the table. So there are a few statistics that we come back to every year, one of which is the price of healthy calories versus unhealthy calories. It's a twofold difference. So unhealthy calories 2 times cheaper than healthier calories. But what's been notable in this year's report is that that difference has been widening in the last couple of years in particular. When we look at lower income families, if you're in the poorest fifth of the population, you'd need to spend 45% of your disposable income on food in order to afford the sort of costed government recommended diet. But you've also got an environment which is pushing you in the wrong direction, even if you've got money in your pocket. For example, advertising spend, a third of food and drink advertising spend is on confectionery and snacks and desserts, soft drinks, compared to 2% on fruit and vegetables. When we look at the high street, a quarter of the places to buy food across the whole country are selling fast food. That number jumps up to nearly 1 in 3 in the most deprived parts of the country. So it's a set of statistics which really describe what we call the food environment, the point at which the food supply meets us. All those different settings in which we're making decisions about what to eat, and it casts light on whether it's actually enabling us to feed our children well and eat in a way which protects our health and well-being. And at the moment, it's all pointing in the wrong direction.
So the 2025 Broken Plate report, which is last in quite a long series of reports, it's not full of optimism.
It's not full of optimism, but what it does do is we highlight where there's some really live conversations happening now with government, which create opportunity for the government to actually move some of these measures decisively in the right direction. You mentioned our food ambassadors earlier. We also did an exercise in this year's report, which is a little bit different, in that we asked them to take photographs of their environments where they're living and tell a story about their personal experience of these statistics, which are at the national level, but bring it back down to what does it mean for them. And they were very powerful stories, which we presented to the Minister in Parliament. And I'm quite confident that they'll be living in his head as he takes this agenda forward.
Let's listen to some of those audio clips.
Hi, my name is Magdalena. I'm representing Liverpool. As food ambassador, I want the food environment shift towards health promoting for the sake of children's health and the future of the UK. Those rotten carrots and mangoes represent the dilapidated surroundings. They look as sad and tired as local people. In contrast, what lightens up the local area is junk food ads, which tease us towards junk. These ads and price promotions make us buy more, spend more and eat more. On the other hand, the 2 boxes full of fresh fruit and veg should be the affordable norm.
Hi, my name's Dominic. I'm a Food Foundation ambassador. I've intentionally not included any pictures of food to highlight the lack of access we have to fresh, nutritious food. If you're from my estate blocks, you're food insecure as your starting point. I want these pictures to go some way to lift the veil on a kind of simplistic approach to engaging with the poor. I want to disrupt the narrative around food poverty to not only being controlled by those that haven't experienced that as a reality. Let's start that discussion and speak soon.
So how did the Minister respond to these photographs and these clips?
Well, I mean, he was clearly touched. And he set out a clear intention to try and tackle some of these challenges. I think we've yet to know exactly what shape that ambition will take.
Well, we invited the government department leading this new food strategy, DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, to come on the programme today, but they declined. Ben Reynolds, you've sat in on some of their briefings. What do you know about their plans?
So, firstly, they have 4 main priorities here. One, as you mentioned already, is to improve access to healthy, affordable food, to shape that food environment. Secondly, to try to improve food security, also to improve growth in the food sector and food businesses, and finally, to reduce the environmental impact of the food and farming system. So that breadth of vision is a good start. The other thing that I'd take a lot of hope from, and we've got to try to take hope where we can, is that this food strategy was announced within the first 100 days of the new government. Usually it takes them about a decade to come around to the fact that what they need is a food strategy. They can't just rely on health strategies, obesity strategies or farming strategies, that they need something that is joined up. So that is hugely, hugely positive. I think what we need to see that is also commonplace with a lot of those previous attempts is there's been a large push around trying to take a voluntary approach. And more often than not, that doesn't work. It doesn't work on its own. And when Steve Reed announced this new food strategy, he said that regulation is not off the table. And therefore, we hope that either whether they use it as a stick to encourage businesses or other stakeholders to adopt the aims of this food strategy, or whether they actually implement it. I think that's hugely encouraging at this stage so early within the government.
Well, someone who knows a lot about working within government to make change is the co-founder of the food chain Leon, Henry Dimbleby, who a few years ago published the National Food Strategy, commissioned by the Conservative government. That strategy was far-reaching, and while some of the environmental recommendations were followed up, almost none were that would have improved our food and our health. Henry couldn't be here today, but I asked him on a video call a few days ago what had surprised him after the report came out to much public acclaim.
What I hadn't appreciated was when something is politically difficult, how it can just be very easily dragged into inaction. So a lot of the food companies will say publicly, we want regulation. We can't do this. If we just go independently on this and remove junk food, someone else will do it. We need regulation. So that is actually almost broadly accepted. But you then get a meeting with Sajid Javid, for example, who was the health secretary at the time. And people will say, oh, well, not that regulation, or you can't do this. And then you have DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, who in some ways are clients of the food companies. So they are, rightly in many ways, nervous about restricting growth. It's our biggest industry. We need it to provide jobs. But that produces a drag on actually something which is making us much less productive, which is our ill health. And then you have the Department for, as was then, Culture, Media and Sport, which says, well, hold on, if you restrict advertising, we're not going to have any children's programmes. And all of these forces leaving health to clear up the mess, all of those forces in the end just lead to stagnation. I think where I'd been naive was I really don't think there is, in the same way that there is in the States, a kind of malevolent, organised lobbying effort. But I had underestimated just the friction that all of those other voices cause and in the end make things impossible to do.
Henry Dimbleby. Well, Dr. Dolly Van Tulleken, you recently worked with Henry Dimbleby on a new report, Nourishing Britain, a political manual for improving the nation's health. Just tell us a little bit about it, who you talked to.
Henry and I both had been sort of collaborating for a couple of years trying to get a bit more progress in the food policy agenda. And I had done this research that basically showed, we'd had hundreds of policies on obesity and food-related ill health over the last 30 years, but, they weren't translating it into any meaningful improvements in terms of our health. And it seemed to be that there were these issues that policies tended to rely on getting individuals to change rather than introducing regulation, and they tended to be voluntary rather than mandatory. And so it seemed that the politics of this agenda was really hard. And so Henry and I wanted to find out from the most senior politicians over the last 30 years why the politics are so hard. What is it like when you are Prime Minister or Health Secretary or Chancellor and you are presented with this issue? Why can't you just do it? And so we interviewed 20 former Prime Ministers, Health Secretaries and other senior politicians from the last 30 years, including people who were at the time of interviewing or still are serving in their positions, including London Mayor Sadiq Khan, including Jeremy Hunt, who was Chancellor at the time. And what was really interesting was the level of agreement. So all these politicians agreed that not enough have been done and that government can and should do more. And then what was really interesting was the fact that some politicians expressed regret at having not done more. And so there was this resounding sense of urgency that they were calling upon today's politicians and tomorrow's politicians to get on with it, stop faffing around, as Seema Kennedy, former Public Health Minister, said.
But why weren't they bolder?
Well, there were lots of issues. So the 4 main barriers that we identified, and again, none of these are probably that surprising, but nanny state accusations. So the single most effective rhetorical weapon over the last 30 years has been the fear of nanny state accusations. And it doesn't matter what party you're from, you are going into office worrying whether you're going to be perceived to be a nanny state government and having to overcome those perceptions. And I loved this quote from William Hague, who said, in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And the problem with having to constantly explain, oh no, we're not going to be increasing food prices or whatever it is that the negative perception is, you're losing that argument. So nanny state accusations and the fears being more felt than the actual realities, which again was really interesting. The influence of industry and business was another major barrier. And it wasn't as simple as industry lobbying. It was also the fact that within government as a whole, you've got whole departments that are set up to protect industry interests. So you can have the Department of Health wanting to address, obesity and food-related ill health with another department that's defending the interests of potentially big food. And we see that played out in individual careers. So you've got someone like Jeremy Hunt, who was the longest-serving health secretary and then later became chancellor. And when he was longest-serving health secretary, he actually talked in our interview about wishing that they'd done more on child obesity at the time and to not be so fearful of the nanny state accusations. But when he was chancellor, he celebrated PepsiCo UK's largest expansion in the UK in 25 years. So you have this tension within a single political career that one minute you could be trying to tackle these industries and then the next minute you could be trying to defend or celebrate their contribution.
What did he say about that contrast?
He in particular didn't sort of address necessarily that particular contrast. We actually had quite a lot of people speak quite openly about those challenges. And it was actually Andy Burnham, who was a Labour Health Secretary as well. He's now Mayor of Greater Manchester. He also was Culture Secretary before being Health Secretary. And he talked about how him and Jeremy both had the experience of defending, the advertising interests and the television interests and then going into health and actually being on the receiving end of their lobbying. And Joe Churchill, who was a Conservative public health minister, basically said the next government will be lobbied hard like the governments before that, and every government is inevitably going to be lobbied by industries, and that is part of being in government. But navigating that and making sure that it doesn't water policy down was something that was really interesting to understand how you do that. And George Osborne, with his soft drinks industry levy, was basically one of the main examples of how you navigate industry lobbying and protect your policy development process from that.
He did it sort of secretly, is the story. He kept it away from the food industry.
Yeah, he basically knew that if there was any public awareness or even private awareness among the industry that the government was going to introduce this big sugar tax, then he was going to have to expend a vast amount of energy defending an idea before it had properly been developed. So he was incredibly careful with keeping it very secret. So other departments didn't know anything about it until it was announced. And then he talked in our interview about how he had to persuade David Cameron. And he goes, come on, we're both experienced enough politicians. We can make the politics work. But it was during that design process that they had that creative and intellectual freedom without having to expend that resource defending it against, media accusations of nanny statism or industry influence. And the other main factor that made it really successful was the fact that he created the public support on the day that he announced it. So he telephoned Jamie Oliver himself and said, can you come out? We're going to announce something that we think you'll like. Can you be there to publicly defend it? And he knew that you had to have a really strong supportive voice to counter potentially negative press or negative industry reactions.
This is a big moment in child health. It's a big signal. It's symbolic that a robust government can actually get control of big business when it's having ill effect on child health.
Well, Ben, you were working with Jamie Oliver and you were there when that phone call came through, right?
Pretty much, yes. It's worth saying that there'd been years of academic research into the case for a soft drinks industry levy. And over the year prior to George Osborne announcing that, we'd really sort of ramped up the campaign for this. And then on the day, Jamie got the call and then Jamie called us. I don't think it went much further than that. But as you said, I think that was George Osborne making sure that he could create the policy he wanted to, but also making sure that it landed well on the day by involving Jamie. And all along, we had got no's from them. No, we're not interested in a soft drinks industry levy. So I think it goes to show with any of the policies that we're working on, or these changes we want, they will see no, and they will say no until they say yes.
In your recent report with Henry, Dolly, you pulled together some ingredients for success. One of those is advice to the new government. Be bold, act fast, no regrets. Something Henry Dimbleby said came out of an interview you did with Sajid Javid.
He understood that people wanted intervention on health, but he said it's not a vote winner. You know, you're not going to go into an election with that being a major vote winner on the campaign trail. But at the same time, as he put it, you know, when you're running into an election, customers aren't going to be angry saying, I can't believe there aren't huge quantities of chocolate at the checkout anymore, therefore I'm going to vote for the other party. That's not going to happen. And so his advice, and I think this is super pertinent for the existing government, is you have to act early, you have to get it out of the way. If you're doing it still in the election, you'll end up with the newspapers talking about this stuff, and it will suck up time from the rest of your message. So I think for this government, who I genuinely believe, you know, they've announced a national food strategy, they've lined that up with health and DEFRA and education. They have to do it soon, because it feels as if the election's a long way away, but in a year's time it won't feel like that. You need to push hard and push early and not have regrets. All of those people that we spoke to who didn't get stuff done said they regretted, or almost all of them said they regretted that they hadn't been bolder and moved harder and moved faster.
Dolly, did the politicians that you talked to have any other thoughts on how you can do that? Be bold, move fast.
Yeah, there were lots of key ingredients. The first one was deploy a compelling argument. And we talk about the fact that argument is essentially a political superpower. It's the politician's way of winning support. And so there are lots of ways that you can carefully frame this agenda, make it a positive, you know, whether it's talking about children and the fact that voters absolutely want the government to play that role in protecting children, or just creating a positive, talking about this in a positive way. So there are lots of ways that you can frame this to make an effective argument. And in a way that poses a challenge to politicians today, you know, who can create the most compelling argument, because that is really their talent. The second is to build a movement. So support exists. We actually know that this isn't just not a vote loser. We know that there is active public support for this agenda. So garnering that support and actually finding it and setting it up, again, talking about George Osborne with the soft drinks industry levy, making sure that you curate it, because it is hard if you're constantly trying to battle the negative arguments. And then also to enlist the Prime Minister was one of them. It was really interesting how many of the people that we interviewed talked about how important prime ministerial backing is. And I've been very pleased to see that Keir Starmer has already spoken about this agenda. It's clearly signalling that it's on his priority list. But I think the real test will come from whether Number 10 actually leads on this specifically, because that doesn't always happen with previous strategies. But echoing what Henry said, don't leave office eating regretty spaghetti. You know, make sure you do as much as you can while you're in office. And actually, what we found from the success stories is that you can get evidence of the effectiveness within single parliamentary terms. So you don't have to wait, 10 years, 15 years, and someone else gets the credit. You can actually get the credit by introducing stuff early. So that's part of the positive of acting fast.
Well, Anna and Ben, you've both been the evidence builder. You've been feeding this to politicians. How did you react to all these politicians, these senior people, just going, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't do better?
Yeah, it's sort of easy to say after it's happened, isn't it? I mean, it's incredibly helpful that the evidence has been pulled together by Dolly and Henry in this way, because I think we can now present it very clearly to the current set of ministers and say, look, don't fall into the same trap.
No excuses.
No excuses, exactly. I mean, I think there's also this point about not losing votes versus winning votes. I think Sadiq Khan is kind of interesting in that respect because, of course, his commitment on free school meals in London and expanding free school meals, he actually put really at the centre of his political campaign that commitment. So I think there are also examples of policy measures in this area which are demonstrably important for vote winning, not just not vote losing, so to speak.
Ben?
I think the report that Dolly has worked on is hugely important timing-wise, that this is on the desk of all those involved within government of taking this forward. I mean, I would add to a couple of those recommendations, and I'd be interested in your views on these, but I think one of the reasons why these have failed in the past is around timing. It didn't help that the previous government food strategies came out within a year or two, those governments have been voted out. So there's no continuity there. And this is why I think one of the recommendations from Dimbleby's strategy, which was picked up by the House of Lords, the importance of legislation. Dimbleby called for a food bill. And actually having this in legislation, when you look at other issues like the environment and the Environment Act, there's that continuity. Future governments have to report on those targets. They have to report on what policies they're putting in place to actually see those things through, rather than strategies just gathering dust. And I think alongside that, and this is really helpful that the government has committed to this within its announcement of this current food strategy, is a vehicle to take it forward. So a body that's going to have oversight to actually ensure that the strategy does actually deliver. And thinking about European parallels there, interestingly, no one in Europe, no country has really put in place any legislation, no food bills. Slovenia is looking at something like that.
But on the other hand, they haven't needed it quite as much as we do.
That is possibly true.
Well, if you look at our health statistics, our obesity statistics, I mean, we are the sick man of Europe, even if we aren't in Europe anymore.
That is definitely true. I think you might argue that some of those countries do care a lot more about their food, and therefore getting it right is incredibly important. And the question is, what difference does a food strategy make compared to just lots of good food policies? Denmark has done very well with implementing lots of food policies without having a coherent strategy, whereas in other cases, I think some of the evidence shows that there's a really strong argument. It comes back to this point of buy-in. So Germany, one of the main takeaways from their food strategy is the buy-in that they got from actually going through that process, consulting. And I think that was very, very true with Dimbleby's strategy, that whilst it wasn't an official government strategy, it did a great job at bringing on board business, bringing on board members of the public, communities behind this vision that unfortunately was not wholly embraced immediately when it came out. But I don't think we'd be where we are now with the new government adopting the call for a food strategy and name-checking Dimbleby's food strategy if it wasn't for A, its existence, and B, the continued engagement that he makes in this.
Absolutely. I mean, it does seem like Henry Dimbleby's food strategy has been tremendously influential. Well, we asked the British Retail Consortium, which represents the supermarkets and other food retailers, about the criticisms made of the industry in Dolly and Henry Dimbleby's Nourishing Britain report. And it told us, food retailers are dedicated to promoting healthy lifestyles amongst their customers. They offer extensive guidance through their websites, in-store magazines, and clearly labelled products to help consumers easily identify and purchase more nutritious options. This not only greatly benefits individual health, but can also contribute positively to the well-being of the planet. They are also supporting their customers to make healthier choices through better calorie labelling, reformulation of products, and portion control. We also have a statement from Kate Halliwell, who's Chief Scientific Officer of the Food and Drink Federation, which represents the food and drink manufacturers.
We welcome the food strategy that government has already announced. We have been calling for something similar for quite a while. We think it's really important that any food strategy is cross-government departments, because there's lots of different policies that are influencing and trying to shape our food sector. So having that bird's eye view across everything we think is really important. We do, of course, talk to government to present our perspective. Government doesn't grow food, it doesn't make food, it doesn't sell food. So, of course, as part of its consultation procedure, it would talk to food companies who do all of those things. And from our perspective, we want to share our expertise, give some of the practicalities of what a policy might mean. It is then, of course, for government to decide, looking across all of the inputs it will get them from us, it will also get them from third parties, from charities. So government then needs to look across all of that and take the decisions it needs to take and drive forward that overarching strategic vision.
Kate Halliwell from the Food and Drink Federation. So, what are the chances that a new food strategy will make a difference? Ben has already made perfectly clear that it has to be embedded in legislation and it has to be monitored. Last year, another influential report, I mean, how many reports are we up to in this programme, was published on the topic from the House of Lords Select Committee for Food, Diet and Obesity. The committee considered the role of ultra-processed foods and foods high in fat, salt and sugar in our health crisis. When that report was published with its tough conclusions of the change needed, I spoke to the committee chair, Baroness Joan Walmsley. Was she worried that the government would be tempted to take the easy way out with a big rollout of the anti-obesity injections rather than tussling with the global food companies and their mighty PR machines?
Changing our food system is going to take a while. I mean, it's taken decades for it to go wrong, and it's probably going to take a lot of years to put it right. And of course, I can understand that for those people living with obesity and health issues that go alongside that, one of these jabs can certainly help. But the NHS is only offering that for 2 years. And at the end of that treatment, those people have got to go back out into the obesogenic environment that we're all facing. So it's a bit like having an alcoholic go through rehab and being released into the bar. Something's got to be done about the whole food environment, or else all that money spent on those anti-obesity jabs is all going to be wasted. But I'm hoping that this government will start the ball rolling. And once the measures that address the problems with our food industry are embedded, I hope the public will say to any future government, don't go back.
Baroness Joan Walmsley. Dolly, was the temptation to use drugs rather than mess with the food industry something you and Henry Dimbleby asked the politicians you interviewed?
We didn't ask it as a question, but we put in a little section into the report about our position on weight loss drugs and whether it's the answer. And it very much sits in line with what Baroness Joan Walmsley has talked about as well, which is absolutely people who require and need healthcare treatment should have access to them. But we can't send people back to the conditions that made them sick in the first place. We must send people back to conditions that enable them to thrive and maintain good health for the rest of their life. And currently, our food system and our food environment does not enable that.
Anna, we've now seen what the government's response was to the House of Lords Committee. Are you as positive about the government's ambition to transform the food system as Baroness Walmsley was when I interviewed her?
Well, actually, I spoke to Baroness Walmsley on Friday, having seen the response, and she was clearly disappointed. We were on a webinar on camera, and she ripped up the government response in front of everybody. And I think a number of us have felt very disappointed. Though you can't expect the government to make new commitments sort of in response to a report. That's not how government makes its announcements. But what we felt was lacking was really a signal of ambition, which we felt they could have done more on. Having said that, we are remaining positive because they concurred really with the diagnosis that the House of Lords had set out and the focus on these food environments which are so harmful. That's significant. And also set out very clearly that the health mission, with the ambition to have the healthiest generation of children ever, which the Prime Minister and Wes Streeting have set out, and also the food strategy. They've clearly said that both of those processes are live and where decisions on some of these areas will be made. So keeping up the pressure now is so important, and we've got to continue to just really make the arguments for why we need ambitious action fast.
Well, let's focus on what might work. Here at the Food Programme, we often come across and highlight organisations that are working against the tide of junk food and meet people who are serious about wanting to improve people's lives through food. Someone who looks to do that through writing and telling stories about the history of our food, farming and culture is Carwyn Graves. He also works for a food education not-for-profit, Cegin y Bobl in Wales, which has recently had an application to become a charity turned down. They're, at the moment, enthusing thousands of people into cooking in Wales while supporting local farmers, economies and creating jobs. But that doesn't give them charitable status.
The sticking point from what they sent us was quite simply that we talk about supporting local producers where possible. So although that's not what we exist to do, they didn't like the fact that we talk about that being a sort of incidental part of our activity, precisely because we're in a rural and we're in a post-industrial county. So most of us know the farmers. And so it seems natural, if we're working to get more food in schools, more working with food and in other community settings, that we'd support those local businesses that are struggling just as a byproduct of our work. So the fact that actually some of the permitted charitable objects that exists in the law includes the promotion of agriculture, the promotion of horticulture and the promotion of commerce doesn't seem to be relevant when it comes to doing work around health and food poverty.
What difference would a government food strategy mean for projects like yours?
Yeah, if we had a government food strategy that was passed into law, and if that food strategy was incorporated into other public sector bodies' ways of working, then it would presumably mean that we wouldn't have this situation where actually food pervades everything and makes a difference to everything, but it's continually in the back seat. And we could actually just make the case in a very straightforward way to say our work is important in this domain of helping people feed themselves affordably and in a healthy way. We could make that case without having to jump through hoops that perhaps were set up for a society that is no longer with us, a society of decades ago. There are lots of people in communities who want to give back, who've got the ability to give back, and you do need community-led groups for that to take place. But government could do such a lot to facilitate that, to create the structures and the space to just enable that to really move forward, rather than, as it feels so often that we're tinkering around the edges.
Catherine Graves. We asked the Charity Commission for a response to the points he made. In a statement, it explained that there are criteria that must be met to be considered a charity, and it is the Charity Commission's statutory duty to apply the law as set out by Parliament, and the reasons for the rejected application were explained to Cegin Ibobble. Fair enough, you might say, but this not joining the dots is holding back real change. Cegin Ibobble has the potential to create change. Ben, do you think there's any sense in government that joining up dots the way they need the dots to be joined up is on the radar of people in government?
So I don't think they're the first food organisation to have their charitable status or potential charitable status rejected. I'm not sure if that is a problem to be levelled at the government or whether it's to be levelled at the Charity Commission, but clearly the two could have a conversation about the roles of these organisations and their importance in our fabric of our society.
Anna?
Yeah, leaving aside the question around the Charity Commission, I think what a Food Act or primary legislation around food can do is help to join up the dots, because what it can say is, this is what our expectations are of the food system. It's got to deliver on our environmental goals, our nature and our climate targets. It's got to deliver on a set of health targets. We've got to maintain a level of food security because there's all of these threats which are currently undermining it. And it's got to play a role in the economy because it already does, and we don't want to damage that. So it's forcing that join-up conversation, because it's saying, well, what are the actual policy mechanisms that we've got that will allow us to deliver on these multiple benefits at once? And the kind of work that Catherine is doing is showing that in real life. What we need, of course, is a policy environment that allows some of that to actually go to scale.
Anna, your food ambassadors clearly feel let down, abandoned by successive governments on this. If this pattern of failure from the top continues, I wondered if there were other ways in which changes could be brought to improve the system locally. This is a question for you all. And I was thinking in particular about legal action, because in December in the United States, we saw the first big lawsuit filed on behalf of one person against what they call big food. That's Kraft, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, Kellogg's, Mars, etc., etc., alleging that these firms, through their deliberate marketing of ultra-processed food, particularly to children, are making people sick. So just a quick answer from you both. Is legal action something that's possible in this country? Dolly?
Yes, it's absolutely a route that we could go down, but I would hope that it's countered with also a pro-food positive campaign, which is about celebrating British food culture. You know, we kind of have accepted defeat when it comes to the British food culture, and actually we have a wonderful food culture and a wonderful food culture history as well, and little nuggets that are thriving around the country today. And I would love it if a politician takes on this argument and makes it a pro-positive food agenda.
Anna?
I completely agree with that. I mean, one of the things that we're really hoping might appear through this food strategy process is, what if we set a sort of national ambition around fruit and veg consumption and then align, you know, public procurement, investment in innovation, support for farmers, what's being served in schools, align it all to that goal. I mean, this is not rocket science in terms of what needs to actually happen. And I think having some of these really fantastic British products centre stage of some of these arguments is really an important part of winning it.
Absolutely. I mean, the things that we grow that are so wonderful. Ben?
I completely agree. And I think picking up on your point there around procurement, so one of the things that's held us back over the last decade with countless attempts to improve our school food and hospital food is at the end of the day, there's no legal way you can actually uphold that. So the importance of creating that legislation in the UK, embedding in it targets around, for example, procurement, and there's been lots of commitments recently from the current government, previous government, around 50% of that food coming from British or sustainable sources. If that gets in legislation, if that's there for future governments, we can actually find a way to make sure that the caterers and procurement officers are actually doing that and supporting sustainable British farmers.
And perhaps we could train them all to, you know, we'd take them around apple farms and asparagus farms, and we could, you know, do cooking lessons the way that they're already doing with doctors.
We've done it before, we can do it again. And
well,
better.
Thank you all, you were marvellous. Dr. Dolly Van Tulleken, Anna Taylor from the Food Foundation, and Ben Reynolds from the think tank, the IEEP, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, UK. Thank you all very, very much.
I'm Alex Krotowski.
And I'm Kevin Fong.
How do you feel about AI?
Does it scare you?
Very quickly that question comes up. You know, is it going to think for us?
Does it excite you?
I say, how is the AI going to help us to think better?
Do you worry about how it'll change your life, your job, your kids?
AI is built into many of the software applications that we now use in the schools every day.
In every episode of The Artificial Human from BBC Radio 4, Kevin and I are here to help. We will chart a course through the world of AI, and we will answer your questions.
It doesn't just lie, but it lies in an incredibly enthusiastic, convincing way. That ability to be able to kind of think critically is just going to be so important as we move forwards.
The Artificial Human with me, Alex Krotowski.
And me, Kevin Fong.
Listen on BBC Sounds.